here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest this week. It's going to be the turn of the author, writer, journalist Jess Rifkin, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff, and also his latest work, which is a book that has just been published, which is titled This Must Be the Place: Music, Community and Vanished Spaces in New York City. It's a fascinating history of the New York music and venue gig scene over the decades, so you're going to find out more about that. Also, he does these walk-in music tours in New York. I'll put a link in the notes below as well about that. But this is the interview. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. Jess, it's over to you.
So, the first thing that really turned me on, which I think is a pretty common story, when I was 4, it was the Beatles.
Right.
But I immediately was just head over heels obsessed. And from there, my parents had been young persons in the 1960s. They were aging hippies and whatever. So through them, it was Bob Dylan, the Grateful Dead, and the Who. The Grateful Dead became my first truly favorite band that I felt was mine. But then I had an older brother who worked in record stores and was a rare record dealer his entire life. And he lived out in Los Angeles. I was growing up in Maryland. He lived out in Los Angeles, and you can find there's a video of Nirvana playing to 4 people at the Rhino record store in LA, and he's one of them.
Right.
So he was in that world. So he started sending me boxes and boxes of vinyl, which was worthless at that point in history, in the 90s. And initially it would just be all these classic rock records, and then slowly, I got the Velvet Underground, and that blew my mind. And from there it was, an easy jump to the Ramones, and then from there it was an easy jump to Sonic Youth, who became and remain my favorite band of all time. And Sonic Youth just opened up an entire universe of weirdo music and film and literature, things that are still unfolding for me decades later.
Nice. So did your parents, by the way, go to Woodstock? Were they the Woodstock generation?
No, my dad hilariously was in San Francisco for Woodstock and New York for Altamont, so he didn't make it to either. But they were both in San Francisco for later 60s and early 70s. And
right.
My dad saw the Grateful Dead any number of times, and he saw the Velvet Underground at Max's Kansas City, without knowing or caring what he was seeing. He was just there, and there was a band playing, and it just so happened it was the Velvet Underground.
This is the joy of being young and just going to gigs, isn't it, really?
Exactly.
You have no idea that they might mean anything in 2 weeks' time or 20 years' time. So, yes, my God. So had they really got themselves part of that counterculture of the 60s movement of being tuned in, turned on and dropping out?
Mm-hmm. My father more than my mother. My mother was more of a folky type. But my father was, at the Fillmore every weekend, and he had all these posters that I've since stolen for, Big Brother and the Holding Company and Country Joe and the Fish and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So when I was a little kid and I suddenly was getting into that because I was 9, 10, something like that. It was such a thrill for him for me to be into this stuff. And I remember my father's a journalist, and he didn't write about music, but when Jerry Garcia died in 1995, he wrote a eulogy for Jerry Garcia that was all about his young son, which was me, who was infatuated with the Grateful Dead, and how do you explain a drug overdose to a kid?
Yes, quite.
Uh,
Yes, this is quite. So, was your sort of formative years then? Were you the '90s generation? That sort of was that your soundtrack?
yes, it was. I was born in 1986, so coming up through the '90s, like the first band that was like contemporary that really felt like mine, like I was like watching them from beginning on, was Radiohead,
Right.
who I felt very lucky to have seen and to have followed.
Yes.
uh, I was too into the Grateful Dead to get into Nirvana when that was happening.
Well,
uh,
quite.
but, but yeah.
Yeah. So because I mean, you were just too young for Woodstock '99, though, weren't you? But did those bands that shaped that lineup were they part of your soundtrack, by the way?
Oh, God, no. I mean, that was like what I was rebelling against, That was what all the kids that beat me up listened to. Uh, I hated that stuff. Limp Bizkit and Corn and, the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Yes.
No, that was bully music. And Woodstock '99, I remember when that happened, like even before it turned into a shit show, I remember seeing that and being like, how dare they co-opt Woodstock for this stupid thing? Uh, yeah.
It was quite, yes, it was just an interesting, I mean, yeah, horrendous lineup and horrendous bands. And,
Oof.
one of the worst periods of music ever in modern time, I would say. But it was just kind of
Mainstream,
curious.
anyway.
It was, yes. Well, it definitely,
Uh,
yes, there was a lot of quite interest in the world of alt country was started to develop quite a lot more at that stage. And also we had Britpop, so that was so different to your bloke lad rock.
but
So
that
you had,
was like, sorry, no, just like that's what I was listening to from afar at that point. I loved Primal Scream, I loved the Happy Mondays. I loved um, just the Stone Roses. Those were the things that I was really infatuated with from afar that felt like exotic to me, the same way that, alt country maybe felt exotic to people across the
yes.
pond.
Well, that was certainly it. Yes, I mean we were into Gillian Welsh and was it
Oh yeah.
Stacey Earle and there was
Mm,
Alison Krauss. I think that there was and there was other people like the truckers, drive-by
drive-by
truckers,
truckers.
all that Jeff Wheely. God, I'm doing
Yeah,
well
Jeff
here.
Tweedy.
Tweedy, that's the one. All that kind of scene. I mean, it all seems. I mean, we also loved Ryan Adams as well, didn't we? And thought
Yeah.
that first album was, or second album was good. So yeah, it was good. So then, how did you navigate the O years? Because this is when you had the streaming, you had yes, the music industry has a massive issue at this point, doesn't it? What was your O years? Because this is, I guess, your 20s going into 30s.
Um, at least on the music front, uh, they were great. They were incredible. I felt very lucky to be alive at that point. The internet had yet to become the absolute just like nightmare that it is now. And it was still this really exciting thing, suddenly like it wasn't so impossible to find out about music. You could read about it online, draw connections from this band to that band, and then you could order records over the internet, or you could download things. There was sort of this golden age of MP3 blogs where every day you just go on and discover like 6 new bands that were all incredible. And at that point in my life, I was also starting to play music. I was in bands, and I was getting really into things that were kind of more on your sort of DIY, indie level, which there was a lot of going on in New York at that point. I came here for college in 2004, and there was a promoter named Todd P. who was putting on shows, all ages shows in the most wacky places, the back of a Mexican restaurant or like an empty vacant lot under the subway or whatever, with all of these incredible bands, some of whom have been kind of forgotten, some of whom have gone on to great success. But I got here just at the right time to see TV on the radio and Animal Collective and the Vivian Girls and Titus Andronicus and Real Estate. And that was also like there was a lot of stuff, like kind of psychedelic folk stuff that was coming out around that time. Joanna Newsom,
Oh, yes.
Devendra Banhart, people like that I was infatuated with. Elephant Six stuff, K Records stuff. And so all of this was just totally accessible to me,
Yeah.
even as someone underage. And it felt like the barrier to entry was like, you just had to be curious, There was no real gatekeeping beyond that.
No. And the band that exported out of New York, were they on your radar, or did you avoid the Strokes?
Oh no, I love the Strokes. I bet that was a little bit earlier. That was kind of the first wave of that stuff. No, I love the Strokes. I love the Yeah Yeah Yeahs. The Strokes are still, I will say, the one time that I saw them, the worst, absolute, just bottom terrible live band that I've ever seen. And I saw them in 2002. What was ostensibly their peak. But I only saw them the once, so maybe it was an off night.
Yes. Well, I did. The guy I interviewed last night, when he saw Nirvana, we were talking, because when they first came to the UK, they were supporting Tad on the Sub Pop, and he said so bad they apologised at the end of, even if they managed to finish their set, because they were just atrocious. So bands, but that was when they did Bleach. So I mean, there was still a few more years, and they had a different drummer. Chad, I remember, was the drummer, because I saw them in Norwich on that particular tour when they came over, because John Peel was our go-to DJ, who was just brilliant, and he was playing this compilation called Sub Pop 100, which was just like, wow, this, like you mentioned, people like the Sonic Youth were just, Daydream Nation came out, but before that we had Sister and Evil, and that collaboration with that track with Lilia. And actually last week I did an interview with Bob Burt, who's got a new album coming out.
Oh, I love Bob. Bob's so great.
And then went on to Pussy Galore, didn't he? Yes. A cool dude. Yes, his 80s was amazing, because he was saying that he was doing silk screen print for Andy Warhol, which was quite, wow, there you go.
Yeah.
The whole question of art, really. So then, as we trundle, you went to college. Then when did you decide? Was this your first book that you've ever done? This must be the place.
Yes, yeah, it was my first book. And it wasn't something that I'd really been planning to do or thinking about doing. I didn't really think of myself as a writer. I guess to get from point A to point B, like I was in bands for, the better part of 15 years, a little more actually. Bunch of different kinds of bands. I did the joke I always tell that I've told too many times at this point is that I've done everything you can possibly do as a musician except succeed.
Right.
But like, I really gave it a good go.
Well, I do remember Meatloaf used to, when he used to say record labels were just that people would start a record label just so they could reject Meatloaf, which I always
Yeah.
But Twisted, I mean, there's a great documentary about Twisted Sister, which I just, not a band that I loved at all, and found quite peculiar. But then the documentary of the film was of them sort of being rejected all through the 70s until they got the record deal in the 80s. And and suddenly the film finishes at that point where they make it. And it was kind of interesting because every record label were told you mustn't sign this band from the head person. We do not want these scumbags on our label. And then they went to Newcastle for this program called The Tube that used to be done by Jules Holland and Paula Yates. And someone just
Mm,
watched it and said, "Oh, I'm going to sign it." Who was a big cheese in a record label, who no one
right.
could sack. And then said, "Guess who I've just signed?" And went, "Oh my God, we can't sack you because you're the kind of a major person." But then obviously
Right.
it turned out to be a gold dust. But it's an amazing story, actually.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
you'd
that's
have
not how it panned out for me.
that was my
But
God. So did you
that's
did you
okay.
have did you have a moment where you sort of quoted Jim Morrison and thought, "This is the end. I'm just going to give this up"?
Yeah. Like I had a few close calls with success. Never quite got there, which in retrospect I'm very grateful for. Um, because it ended with my life taking the course that it took, which suits me much better than that ever suited me. But yeah, I was like playing to smaller and smaller and smaller audiences. And I was in my early 30s and sleeping on floors and playing to 15 people had been really exotic when I was 18. And at that point, it was just depressing. Um, and I hadn't bothered to cultivate like any other skills in life besides knowing about music and being in bands and New York being what it is. Like I couldn't even get a record store job. Those were super competitive. So what was I going to do with uh, this, esoteric knowledge? And then it occurred to me one day to do walking tours. And, that wasn't really happening. Or there were people doing music walking tours in the city, but from a very different angle. They were doing more kind of classic rock stuff. And, I wanted to talk about Sonic Youth and I wanted to talk about the Velvet Underground and about um, early disco stuff and the Beastie Boys and Arthur Russell and um, so I started a walking tour business in the tail end of 2017,
Right.
which I still have.
You still have,
And
actually. And you go out
yeah,
like twice, three times a week, don't you?
yeah. Generally speaking, Friday through Sunday, I'm out there on the streets. I was out there today, actually doing a private tour. But yeah, I love it. It's an amazing thing to do, and I thought it would be something I'd do periodically. But it turns out that this music is actually like really widely loved and not nearly as obscure as we imagine it to be. And people from all over the world want to come see where the Velvet Underground played, and so I did that, and it just started really taking off. And then at like the tail end of 2019, because that was getting some attention, um, this editor approached me. He looked at some of what I had done and looked at what I had on Instagram and whatever else, and he was like, "Hey, have you thought about turning this into a book?" And I hadn't. I really hadn't. Um, but he was an editor at a big publisher, and it was such a great opportunity that I was like, I absolutely have to do this. I can't turn this down. Let's
Yes.
see what happens.
Was it slightly
Yeah.
terrifying, suddenly thinking, actually, I've got to write, I've got to put sentences, I can't, I'll get caught out. I will be pointed at in the street.
It might have been scarier for me than it was. My father, as I mentioned before, is a writer. He wrote two books. My wife is a writer. At that point, she'd written two books, and now she's written a third. So I'd seen people writing books up close. And granted, I hadn't seen anybody writing very dense history books, so I kind of underestimated how much work it was going to be.
Yes.
Um, but I was just like, I I guess I can learn how to do this. I started by interviewing people who I had personal relationships with. Because of that time that I'd spent around kind of DIY stuff in New York in the 2000s, I knew some people who had been, promoters and or were in bands that had gone on to be rather successful. So I started talking to people I knew to kind of like get my interviewing chops up. And uh, you know, originally I it was supposed to be an 80,000 word book, and I had 8 months to write it,
Right.
and it ended up being like double that length, and it took me the
Yes.
better part of 3 years.
Yeah, I would imagine. Did you, with your interviews, was it a bit tricky knowing when to stop and thinking, God, I've got quite a few hours. I only needed, probably a few nice little segments. But, did you start collecting too much information that you suddenly needed to edit and sort of condense into something that was coherent?
Yes, I did. I, at some point, I don't know if maybe I was scared to get to the writing part. Probably a little bit of that, but I ended up doing 140 something interviews. And every door I would open would lead to like six more doors. And the intention from the outset was to write a book that kind of talked about the whole spectrum of music in New York City, you know, over the course of a long period of time. Um, and so, it just kept expanding and expanding and expanding. And I wrote the book chapter by chapter and turned it in to my editor. And after it was all turned in, he was like, he called me and he was like, "Hey, do you know how long your book is?" No, it's like, no, I actually don't. It was like, it's 1,000 pages. I can't read this thing. Like you have to make cuts. Uh, so quite a bit actually ended up getting cut from the final product. Most of which I don't miss. I think the cuts that were made were reasonable cuts. It's more, that I feel bad that I wasn't able to include quotes from everybody that I talked to or things like that, or tell every
Yes.
backstory. But
Yes,
uh,
the guilt must be playing on your day and night, mustn't it, really? All those kind of great moments, people being sort of immortalized in your book, and then, but
mhm.
that's the joy of it all. So then, so it's a book which is kind of based on the kind of the main clubs and scenes in New York, starting out. Is it kind of from the Greenwich Village kind of folk scene right through to sort of modern time? So you
Mhm.
got 11 chapters, which is quite dense. So there must be some which you thought, God, this is fine. I'm with it. Some which must be like, oh, that's kind of going to take a lot of research. Which one did you? I mean, was it quite easy to bring these 11 chapters to sort of map that out to begin with, and then start just adding pieces, or how did that process go?
The end result ultimately didn't look that different from the book that I proposed in terms of the chapter breakdown. Um, some of it's more that things ended up being a little more expansive. A chapter that I thought would be about a venue turned out to be about a genre and a network of venues. There was a chapter that was supposed to just be about the club Max's Kansas City, which ended up becoming more about glam rock in New York City in general, and the emergence of punk before CBGB. Um, because it became clear that you can't talk about this place without talking about that place, without talking about this person, that person. Um, you know, uh, some chapters were easier for me than others because people, some eras, more people were willing to talk to me, and others people were less willing to talk to me.
Right.
You know, it
Did
was.
you feel that at that stage there were going to be certain issues that were going to sort of like will need to be navigated, because people have quite a strange and strong ownership of these kind of narratives from the past, and somebody's story, like Max's Kansas City, probably has various people who feel that that's theirs, and someone else going, well, it's possibly mine as well, and there's that person, but they're no longer with us. Did you feel like you might be treading on some sensitive little emotional landmines at that stage as well?
Oh, I absolutely was. Yeah. Um, you know, the 140 people that I spoke to were the ones that said yes. I probably emailed 500 people. Um, and in some cases, there were people who said yes and never got back to me, or people who turned me down who were like very central characters in the narrative, who I then had to write around, um,
Yes.
which was a little tricky because I'm talking about these people and they're still alive, and I have to just kind of like, I can't put words in their mouth or presume their motivations. Um, I had to go with old interviews and things like that, and it was also, people from some scenes were more open to talking to me than from other scenes. You know, like generally, the first chapter, which is about folk music in Greenwich Village, some of the people in that chapter are like among the most famous people in the book, because at this point, they're very famous, but people aren't necessarily banging their door down to try to talk to them. So they were happy to chat, whereas
Right.
it was a challenge. Like there was no way that I was going to get Patti Smith to talk or David Byrne or like I did talk to Bob Burt, but none of the other members of Sonic Youth were open to it. I tried to get Doug Yule from the Velvet Underground, and that was a dead end. There were a lot of people from the hip hop world that I really hoped would talk to me, who just flat out turned me down or never wrote back. So at a certain point, I just kind of had to make do with who said yes and what information I could find, and that shaped what I was and wasn't able to write about.
Yes, God. So you start with the Greenwich, the folk scene from the sort of late 50s,
Mm-hmm.
60s, I suppose, kind of on the coattails of the Beat generation. And so did you sort of, was there any scene before that you could have included, or did you feel like, no, let's start with that because that slightly slips into, the Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and then you're away? Did it feel like, okay, this kind of is quite a clean one rather than starting with sort of, I don't know, the 50s rock and roll and bebop and stuff like that?
Yeah, it was pretty, like, I knew going in that that was the beginning, um, for a few reasons. Uh, one being that it was probably the furthest I could go back where there were still enough people for me to talk to, rather than drawing entirely on secondary sources that people have already seen.
Yes.
But there's sort of, in as much as the book is just a history of music in New York, there's an undercurrent to it, um, which is that it's really the history of the relationship between music and gentrification in New York City. How what role music played in the gentrification of these various neighborhoods that these scenes called home, because it's a very they really go hand in hand, unfortunately. And where you have bebop or whatever, or there's doo-wop on street corners in the 50s or whatnot, none of that is a gentrifying force. um, you know in no small part because a lot of that music is being made by people of color.
Yes.
the folk scene in Greenwich Village is the first time where an underground music community develops and then gains a lot of traction, a lot of attention, and that brings a lot more people and a lot more money into the neighborhood to follow in these people's footsteps, and turns it into an area that's, too expensive for the artists to survive and is full of tourists and carpetbaggers and whatever. Um, that kind of set the template that then all of these other scenes that followed kind of fit into.
Yes.
Which is
This is
also why there's not nearly as much about hip hop in that book, because hip hop, for what it's worth, never really gentrified any neighborhoods. Um, it's really about the connection between music and real estate.
wow, that's an amazing connection, isn't it? Because it's kind of that documented quite well, isn't it? That New York had almost been abandoned in the 70s and no
Mm-hmm.
one wanted to live there. But then it was the sort of the birth of punk, disco, and hip hop, three musical genres, which is kind of extraordinary. So would you put that a lot down to the fact that music and the arts help, you know, New York rediscover itself and sort of become what it is today?
Unquestionably, there's no doubt in my mind. And you talk about those three genres at the time. There was also like salsa was emerging in New York City, and there was a lot of like avant-garde free jazz and things like that.
Yes,
Um,
God.
so it was this incredibly vibrant period, to say nothing of all the visual art and cinema and writing. Because New York City was so economically distressed in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, all these people could come here and, you know, some of them end up finding quite a bit of success, and they become sort of emissaries for this downtown underground culture. You look at Blondie, who had, was it four number one hits in four different genres?
Yes,
Like
this is true.
they're turning people onto punk. They're crossing over to disco. They have the first number one rap record, which is just ridiculous that that's true, but it is. Um, and that brings more attention to the area, especially downtown Manhattan. People want to be around this stuff, so they move in, and more businesses open to cater to those people, and so more people come, and things get quote unquote safer, and the rents go up, and then the poor people all get pushed out, and then the artists all get pushed out, and it's just another boring, fancy neighborhood, and it happens over and over and over again in New York City, every decade.
Yes. Why does CBGB's get so much more attention than Max's Kansas City? Because Max's is kind of before that. That's got the Andy Warhol crowd. There's great pictures of David Bowie there. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
why does it not have that same attention? There has been actually films about it recently, but I mean, it doesn't seem to get such the kudos, shall we say?
Yeah. Well, I don't think Max's is by any means overlooked or forgotten, but CBGB looms so large. It's um, arguably the most significant American rock and roll venue ever. And a lot of that is purely because of its longevity, right? CBGB, like it opens as CBGB, in 73, and it closed in 2006. And, the last several years of it, it was just, it was like a punchline. It was just a tourist trap. But even so, through the 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s, it was an incredibly vibrant place. Uh, you know, so many people played there, and it's not like it just it's not that just the punk scene in the 70s came out of it and then that was it. It was an incubator for hardcore in the early 80s. It was an incubator for no wave and post punk, for a lot of indie rock stuff. It was where the Police played their first American show. AC/DC played there. Elvis Costello. Um, Pearl Jam and Green Day and Pavement and the Manic Street Preachers and Slater Kinney and up through like the Strokes playing there. It was the kind of place that so much came through. Like one of my favorite, just super bizarre examples is that the Dave Matthews Band played their first New York show there, opening for Yo La Tango.
Right.
That's the kind of thing that might happen at CBGB. And so just by virtue of the fact that it lasted that long, and then because of that, so many people were able to go to it, and there's so much documentation of it. So it looms so very large in the New York mythos.
Well, it was interesting because I think, yes, 2 weeks ago, I think there was I interviewed a chap who's just done a compilation, hasn't he, for Cherry Red Records on the soundtrack of CBGBs. So I guess that gets that. But then you made quite an interesting point that above, no one's ever mentioned this, but above CBGBs, is the homeless hostel. Which must have made them sort of regret being homeless. What was it? Were they soundproofed, by the way? I mean, it does sound like. No, they must have been homeless and had mental health issues to do with not sleeping at night.
It's so funny because when it does get talked about, the shelter up there gets talked about either as like almost a source of amusement for these people, like there'd be like bums fighting outside or whatever, or it's like ambiance, or in the story of CBGB closing, it becomes the antagonist, right? This awful, greedy, homeless shelter kicks out this like past its prime punk club. But CB's, I think, only was able to survive as long as it was because it was underneath a homeless shelter. Had that shelter left at any point, that would have turned into apartments. And the second you have somebody in there who's paying rent of any substance, the noise complaints roll in, the cops show up. The club would have closed decades before it did.
Right. That's interesting.
So it was only, it was only able to survive because it was underneath like the people at the bottom of the economic level that no one with any power cares about.
No. And then with Max's, you pointed out that the reason that was doing well was because there wasn't the music, it was the food that they were serving during the daytime. So again, that's a kind of a story that we don't really hear about. And I guess this is what a lot of clubs have the problems with, that the money they have from shows doesn't actually pay a lot. It's your other side hustles that you have to develop to keep a scene going, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to me. There's a thing today that I saw today. The website Resident Advisor, which is this like big dance music website, ran some article on, talking to different DJs about like what's wrong with dance music today. And someone, I can't remember who it was complaining that sobriety culture, as he put it, was destroying dance music because, these clubs that exist for DJs that, people aren't drinking as much and they aren't spending as much time there. And, it's amusing to me because so many venues obviously are predicated entirely on alcohol sales. But that seems to me to be a really myopic and uncreative thing to depend on entirely. You know, Max's was able to do what it was, and they gave away a lot of drinks and they gave away food because they had this lunch hour for office workers that did really, really, really well. You know, they sold
Right.
lobsters and steaks, not cheap food, you know, that these people were buying. So at night, they could have the Velvet Underground, you know, or they could have Bob Marley opening for Bruce Springsteen before anybody knew who either of them were. You know, they could take these risks because they had that income. Or there's another place in the book called Sidewalk Cafe where, you know, a lot of the like 80s, 90s, 2000s kind of anti-folk stuff was coming out of, which was a 24-hour restaurant, and there was a venue in the back, and the restaurant completely underwrote it, you know? Or, you know, there's clubs like the Paradise Garage, this famous dance club, which didn't have booze, and that allowed it to be open all night, and, you know, it wasn't regulated, and there were memberships and there was food, and you know, they were able to not only survive but thrive.
Right.
So I think these stories are really uh, important and really valuable to like reiterate over and over and over that a venue doesn't have to look like just one thing. And you know, especially now that young people are drinking less than ever, that's a documented thing. It's really imperative for people to remember that and try to find other ways to subsidize nightlife.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because I do remember hearing people getting very worried at the student union at the university here because they used to just get away with so much. The management could be rubbish because the sales at the bar was so good that you could have a monkey running the place because they were just the students were drinking, and then another generation starts coming through and they're drinking less, and suddenly the management are going, well, God, I thought it was my brilliance, but actually it was just because we encourage, the drinking culture, smoking culture. They would have a place at the UEA which was like one side for smokers, one for non-smokers. This is in, from up to the
Yeah.
90s. Nobody sat in the non-smoking scene apart from a few sort of embarrassed looking probably Christians or somebody, but the other
Right.
side was packed, and it was like a nicotine stained kind of ceiling. It was disgusting, and I was asthmatic, but again I would join that scene rather than the two
Right.
looking awkward people who probably did bell ringing as a sort of a social society thing. It was just like it
And of
wasn't
course,
a
if it's
thing.
indoors, the smoke goes over anyway.
Yes, and
So,
they still got it. It didn't matter.
right.
But yeah, I mean that's kind of, so it was a really interesting thing about kind of Max's on that front, that actually it was like, the management were obviously clued up enough to understand it. I mean, the other thing, because I know it's interesting because Adele Bertay's just done a book, hasn't she, on New York and various bits and pieces. I mean, the thing that often
Who is
people
it?
talk, Adele Bertay.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I just finished that. That book's amazing.
Yes, and she's just been over to the UK to do her promotion. She's so cool.
Yeah.
But the drug scene in New York sounded quite horrendous at that stage. The sort of the cheap heroin, people being sort of strung out and hooked on it. I mean, did that, and then cocaine with the sort of Studio 54 and the disco scene. I mean, that also must have had a massive impact on that community of not only sort of great poverty and sort of crime, but just the amount of drugs in the city as well. Does that sort of come through in the book as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, I was wary of putting in too much debauchery. Because to me, that's like the least interesting part of any of this. I don't find drug use to be particularly compelling or romantic. But, you know, a big part of what happens, especially in parts of the East Village in the 70s and 80s, is that there's such a rampant heroin scene. And there's so much drug dealing. There's a part of the East Village called Alphabet City, because it's Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C, Avenue D. And, there's a thing people used to say. It was Avenue A is alcohol, B is blow, C is crack, D is death. And it was just like an open air drug supermarket, in no small part because it was a heavily minority neighborhood. And when the city went bankrupt in the 70s, they funneled what little resources they had into the richest, whitest areas and just allowed these working class minority neighborhoods to fester. And so, the stuff wasn't particularly paid attention to. And like, because of that, and because the area was sort of foreboding as a result of this explosion of drug culture there, a lot of music was able to take root for decades in that area. It took a long time to turn around, and it wasn't until the late 80s where there was a giant riot in the park, in Tompkins Square Park in the middle of Alphabet City, a riot over sort of the beginnings of gentrification in that neighborhood, that things even began to pivot. But, that's where you have tons of jazz, tons of salsa, tons of punk and post-punk and hardcore punk and noise. And there's a hardcore punk scene there that's all like teenagers and preteens, really young kids who are like staying up all night and sure, some of them are drinking, some of them are doing drugs. But it's in these venues that are completely unlicensed, and that's only able to thrive as it did and survive as much as it was able to because that area was so um, economically distressed and overrun with drugs. Um, but ultimately, I think the biggest impact drugs had on music in New York City is just that it killed a ton of people and it took a bunch of people out of commission who otherwise would have been really vital in helping to keep things afloat, helping to fight against the waves of gentrification, especially in a lot of older buildings when you have this wave of people dying of heroin overdoses in the 70s and the 80s, along with AIDS, which took a lot of lives. Like that had a huge impact on the demographics of the neighborhood because suddenly there's all these empty apartments and they're going market rate one after another, and people with more money are moving in.
Yes, God, I do remember actually, as you just said that. I did the interview with this author who did Richard, who did the Mud
Oh,
Club,
Richard, yeah, Richard
and
Bach.
and he said that he bought a place just around that time, which obviously was very cheap, and he's still living
Right.
there. And he said, God, thank God I bought that place because that just gave me a home, basically. So that was kind of interesting. Because the one thing about New York and the punk, I suppose the punk scene is quite interesting because New York punk scene and the UK punk scene, I find, is so different because it becomes very basic in the UK. Suddenly you went from the Sex Pistols to the Clash to Sham 69 to just like
Mm-hmm.
pub rock. Whereas the New York scene suddenly had this new wave, music, and kind of you brought in the jazz and the sort of different rhythms from different places around the world. You had that record label Z Records as well, who had
Right.
really interesting bits. And you also had studios. You had, was it Martin BC Studios?
Yeah,
BC
Martin
Studio.
BC, I
And
think still has that same studio.
he still has that. It's such a groovy place and a great film. I mean, did you sort of, I mean, I guess, what's your sort of theory or take on the fact that New York brought in such an incredibly eclectic sort of type of music, which was very different to what was happening in the UK? Was it just the population and this kind of love of kind of freeform jazz as well as kind of African beats or South American beats?
Um, I'll preface my answer by saying that I'm by no means an authority on the UK, but my understanding of the difference is kind of twofold, or threefold. The first is that in New York, when punk emerged in New York, all it really means is bands from the same neighborhood that play at the same two clubs. You know, Patti Smith sounds nothing like Talking Heads. Television sound nothing like the Ramones. Um, this stuff all gets called punk purely by virtue of the fact that they're all hanging out at the same place. That's all it means.
Right.
And the Ramones are then the first band from that scene to go on tour in the UK. And, a lot of this stuff kind of emerges in their wake. And you also have Martin McLaren, who had briefly managed the New York Dolls over here and who had encountered Richard Hell and, uses that as a pattern for the Sex Pistols. And so then the punk that emerges in the UK is based on a template, or a few templates, and a sound and an aesthetic, rather than it just being a catch-all term for a venue or a neighborhood, right? It becomes kind of codified, and then when that then is exported back to the United States, that's when you get like hardcore punk, and you get a lot of the LA punk stuff that came out in the early '80s, like the Germs and Black Flag and things like that. Um, it becomes increasingly, the definition of what punk is becomes increasingly codified and increasingly narrowed. But I think you also have a lot going on. You have a lot more cross pollination in New York City than you have in most other places, because not only is it um, an immigrant city, which obviously, London is a huge immigrant city as well, and plenty of other places are. But, New York is, for a long time, the entry point to the United States for people from all over the world. And so you have, all these things going on. But Manhattan geographically is very, very small. You can get from the westernmost point to the easternmost point of the island in like under an hour. You can walk the entire length of the island in, I think, under 4 hours. And so rather than expand out as most cities do, it grew up. You
Right.
know, it built on top of itself until things start really, Manhattan gets so gentrified that things start moving out to Brooklyn, to Queens. Uh, so, you have people from incredibly different backgrounds with incredibly different tastes living side by side like sardines. And it's not a car city, it's a public transit city, and it's a walking city. So you encounter so much over the course of your day just going about your life that you wouldn't in a city where you had even slightly more isolation. Um, you know, like CBGB, sure, it was where it was on the Bowery. It was this, remote street um, that, quote unquote, no one was going to. But like, I think 3 doors up from CBGB, there was a club called the Tin Palace, which was this like experimental jazz club that predated it.
Right.
And it's right around the corner from two other big jazz venues, Studio Rivby and the Ladies Fort, which were concurrent to it, and just a couple blocks from the Loft, where David Mancuso was holding these parties that were kind of the birth of disco. And none of this stuff is so um, defined, and there aren't so many barriers. There's plenty of people who are going to the early disco parties who are also going to see the New York Dolls, or also going to see the Ramones. It's just, if you lived downtown, you were cool and into music and into partying, you encountered this stuff. And so these interesting combinations emerge just out of that like pressure cooker.
Yes.
Uh,
And did you sort of feel, because I felt with the sort of music scene as well, it's sort of interesting the political period, especially for me, I suppose the 80s was kind of one of my decades, I suppose, was, it was also the year of Thatcher, the decade of Thatcher and the
Hmm.
Conservatives. And you had this kind of, a real ideal philosophy that she had, that she wanted to privatize everything. She loved the American model of capitalism. You had Reagan at that stage.
Yeah.
And I sort of find with the music scene, every 5 years, there's kind of all 3 to 5 years, there's real change. The next wave of 16 to 18 year olds come along. They want to have their scene, they want to discover their bands. And a band who's on their third album is almost like, oh, for God's sake, they've been around the
Right.
shop. They've been, they've been, I don't know, touched by other people, and people know them. You want to discover your own sort of scene. Did you find that with the in New York as well, that clubs would come along that represented a particular little group, a period for a group of people from a particular period for 3 to 5 years, and that was their zeitgeist moment, and then that disappears, and then another scene comes along. I just wondered if you could see that pattern doing a book on venues and scenes, because the two are so kind of
Mhm.
ensconced together.
Oh, no question in my mind. A place like CBGB that lasts for as long as it did is really the exception to the rule. By and large, clubs in New York at least have, you know, 3, 4 good years if they're lucky. The ones that last a decade without falling into parody are like, real shining examples of something. Um, one of the most interesting places to me that I wrote about in the book is this club Tier 3,
Oh yeah, so
which,
is tier three? Would you put that in the same sort of like with Danceteria and Hurrahs? Would that all
Mhm.
fit together in the same kind of vibe?
Yeah, Tier 3 was ever so slightly earlier than Danceteria. But it was concurrent with Hurrah, it was concurrent with the Mud Club. Um, and certainly there was overlap with Danceteria. But the Mud Club is probably the one it's most closely tied to, just because geographically they're only a handful of blocks apart in Tribeca. But Tier 3, before I worked on the book, I knew very little about it. There was very little writing about Tier 3, very little documentation. It would just be mentioned as an aside, even in books about that era and that scene. And as I dug into it a little bit, like, it turned out just every incredible band played there. Um, the a lot of British bands played their first New York shows or their first American shows there. The Slits and the Raincoats and Madness and New Order and Bauhaus. But that's also where, like, the Beastie Boys formed there, and there's early, like, Lydia Lunch was playing there, and the Bush Tetras, and all these kind of really cool downtown, you know, post punk bands and art rock bands. And it lasted for a year and a half.
Right.
And it was there, it was run entirely pretty much by women who weren't chasing publicity in the same way that the people that owned Danceteria or the Mud Club were. And so, it was more just a place where, like, this community that already existed was coming and hanging out, and everybody was having a great time together. So when I started, scratching the surface with it, like, every artist I talked to from that era who wasn't employed at a different club was was just like, oh yeah, Tier 3 was the best club. That was my favorite place.
Right.
And, um, so many seeds were planted there that then grow elsewhere, whether it's at Danceteria or whether it's the Beastie Boys or Sonic Youth. Uh, Danceteria. I'm sorry, not Danceteria. Like, Tier 3, it's such a flash in the pan that people don't write about it, but if you look at it, at all, it's important, and um, that's not atypical. The Mud Club existed from 1978 to 83, but it only really had like 2 or 3 good years.
Right.
The same can be said of all the folk clubs in Greenwich Village. The same can be said of um, a lot of the kind of like avant-garde jazz venues during that era. The and there were places that survived for a very long time, like the Pyramid Club, or this place invented in Greenwich Village called the Cafe Wa that's still there, where it's like hard to take it seriously now. You tell people that the Cafe Wa was an important venue, and it just doesn't compute because it's like this corny, stupid tourist trap. You know, Jimi Hendrix was quote unquote discovered there, and now they have Jimi Hendrix impersonators and cover bands, and it's just like the corniest, goofiest thing. And it would be so much more respected if somebody just put it out of its misery.
Yes, this is true. How important was Studio 54 to New York? Do you think that sort of helped sort of, I don't know, was that the launch pad of so much that sort of went into New York after the sort of the late 70s, early 80s? Because that's the one that gets documented, and there's great stories and documentaries about it.
Yeah. I think Studio 54 is incredibly significant to New York City and not particularly significant to music. Um, you know, Disco, by the time Studio 54 opens, that's the commercialization of something that had been developing underground for some time. Disco, when it first emerges, it's coming out of the queer community, Italian American community, Latino community, Black community. It's this really creative, really, the DJs are really improvisational. Um, a lot of it is like private parties with memberships and things like that. So it's really about community, things like that. And then Studio 54 comes along and pours a ton of money into it, and it's this huge spectacle. And instead of like memberships, they have a exclusive door where it's all about kissing celebrities' asses, and you know um, just who looks right and things like that. And there's this big decor of a moon with a cocaine spoon, which should tell you everything you need to know about that club. It was, they had some great DJs. They had some really credible DJs there, but you see photos of like, um, the most ridiculous one to me is like you see photos of Woody Allen at Studio 54.
Yes.
I don't think he was going to like hear specific remixes of disco tracks, or or like Liza Minnelli and Halston and whoever, uh, Aerosmith, like these people. It's just about the party, and I think it um, you know not that it invented, but it really helped along what ends up becoming the New York culture of the 80s and 90s that has endured, which is far more about spectacle and celebrity and money and who has money. Um, you know, uh, that's like that's the nightlife culture in New York from whence Donald Trump emerges.
Indeed, a bit of yes, indeed. So actually, on sort of a bit of a higher bit. I mean, one other fascinating section is the anti-folk club and the musicians that came out of that. Do you want to just explain a bit more about the anti-folk club? Because I found that quite interesting, especially Cindy Lee, Berry Berry Hill, and
Yeah.
also Beck as well. And this kind of scene, we mentioned the 90s, jock rock kind of gang blokes, but then there was this other scene that was kind of much more interesting underneath. So how did this develop in New York?
Yeah, well, anti-folk was something that was one of the chapters I was most excited to write for this book. Um, because even though people, some people know about it and it gets talked about, I think it gets kind of uh, diminished in New York music history. Even though some very famous people have come out of it, Beck, the most famous, but Regina Spektor.
Oh my God, your mic's gone dead. Your mic, it's gone. You just mentioned Beck and somebody Spectre. It's like the ghost in the machine.
Shit.
No, you're back.
Okay, you can hear me now?
I can. Yes, I know.
Okay.
You got to
I have no
Beck.
idea. No idea what happened. All right. So yes, famous people come out of it, including Beck, Regina Spektor, the Moldy Peaches, Michelle Schacht. But anti-folk ultimately is sort of like earnest and often kind of funny in a way that I think doesn't always register as like cool, quote unquote, in the way that people think of New York, like New York cool. But anti-folk is this community that forms in the early 80s around a singer-songwriter named Latch, who starts throwing open mics in his apartment. And this community kind of comes together of people who are really influenced by, Dylan and things like that, but are also into punk and are also into early hip hop and are drawing from a more expansive palette. And they, they move around to a few different bars, holding these like long, very interesting, very creative open mics. Um, that's famously like Beck comes from L.A. to New York as a teenager, a high school dropout. He starts
So on
frequenting
the Beck front,
these
which
open
sorry
mics.
to interrupt you,
Yeah,
but do you want to?
of
Because
course.
I didn't bizarrely, I did an interview with his mother, but I hadn't. I was more initially was interested in the mother, and then she went, "Oh yeah, my son's Beck." Well, I knew that just beforehand,
Yeah.
but yes, do you want to explain who his very intriguing parents are?
Yes. So Beck's mother, Beeb, I think her name is pronounced Beeb.
Beebe
Uh,
Hansen.
yeah, Beeb Hansen. Her father, Al Hansen, was a Fluxus artist who was around like Yoko Ono and people like that in the 60s. Beeb was a teenage Warhol acolyte. And later was.
And also she'd done God, I'm so sorry about that. But she'd done a single, hadn't she, with Jan Kerouac, Jack Kerouac's daughter, that he didn't realize. A one single with the Whippets.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
When she
No,
was about when she was about 13 and was living on the streets before meeting
yeah.
Andy in the 60s, which I kind of feel like, oh my God, that is a bit weird, but you survived it.
Mhm. Yeah, no, it's wild. And then Beck's father is this guy David Campbell, who's like a famous string arranger in LA. Um, Actually, a very, very good friend of mine, a writer named Josie Riesman, just wrote a biography of Beck that's coming out in a few months, which I've had the pleasure of reading, and it is incredible. So I'm gonna plug that on her behalf. She dug up a lot of stuff that no one up to this point has been aware of. Um, but Beck grows up in LA, and even though his mother's from New York, he has this kind of like New York background, and he decides to have this adventure. He takes a Greyhound bus to New York, sleeps on park benches, sleeps on people's floors and couches, and is busking and just playing like old blues songs and Woody Guthrie songs, and is kind of uh, New York is where he starts to find his voice as a singer songwriter. and then he's violently mugged on the street, and it freaks him out. And he goes back to LA. Everyone here forgets about him, and then a few years later, Loser comes out, and it's, this whole big thing that really, Beck's now doing a lot of press, and he's talking about the anti-folk community back in New York City, and it kind of like electrifies this thing, brings it back, and it ends up finding a long-term home at a 24-hour restaurant called the Sidewalk Cafe, which I think is the longest-running open mic in American history, or at least it was. Where the open mics would go all night long, and all these people would come and play, and you know to me it's one of the scenes with like the most longevity and scope. Like it rivals CBGB, it rivals the Loft, which is this long running disco party, in terms of just how it was able to survive. So I think it deserves a lot more credit and a lot more attention than it gets.
Yes, God, it's kind of, yeah, no, it's just a fascinating, and I suppose I just love all these little scenes and stories and snippets, really. Because again, there was an amazing interview with Suzanne Vega and
Mm-hmm.
God, the guy who produced it called Lenny Kay, and it was like they were
Yeah.
still recording that first album, and they just went on to some radio show in New York to talk about it, and she played a few songs and was still having to sort of do a few more vocal takes. But then, talking about playing, these like folk clubs in New York, and it was there that she was spotted. So, I mean, I suppose the thing
Right.
that comes out from your book is just how much art and artists in music, in film, in sort of I don't know, just every genre just comes out of one city. It's kind of it's an amazing book because you managed to sort of capture
Here.
that essence really, and I sort of blows your mind really, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean it's still like it's so funny to me. I get jealous in a way going to the UK and going to London and seeing all the blue plaques everywhere that everything happened. Like New York just does not do that at all. Especially for this kind of, relatively contemporary countercultural history or whatever. Um, but it's because there's so much history of every stripe so geographically compressed that if you put a plaque on every building, you put a plaque on every building. And then, that's just it's game over. You can't, you know, change anything or demolish anything or whatever. But there's so much history, especially in Lower Manhattan. Um, so many old buildings and so many ghosts of all these things. So much cultural exchange. I can't speak really to the rest of the world, but at least in the United States, there's no other city even remotely like it. Even a city like LA is pretty spread out and pretty segregated.
Yes.
Um, New York is just so dense, and so the boundaries between communities and eras and neighborhoods are so porous
And do you
that the stuff's
still,
just
I
happening.
mean, I know it's a bit tricky as you get older. Do you still feel though that the kids grown up, are they making their history at this moment? Are there sort of things that they're doing, the clubs they're going to and the bands they're seeing? Will that have the same sort of effect on them as it would have done our generation and previous generations?
I don't feel 100% qualified to answer that question because I'm not a young person, but I will say from what I've seen, there's sort of two contradictory answers. One is like unequivocally yes. The whole point of this book is that, music and culture, and especially subculture, always finds a way. It's the weeds that grow around the pavement. Like you can't survive this way or whatever, fine, you go over here. And there's always going to be a, a need among people for self-expression and for community and for art that I don't see that going away. On the other hand, the kind of downside of the internet, a downside, there's many downsides, but a downside of the internet is that now so much from the past is accessible, so easily accessible, that it's harder for new things to find a place, to find an audience
Right.
outside of an immediate community. Um, you know, Especially when like they keep remixing and re-releasing Beatles records just to keep like juicing the back catalogs. Uh, there's no centralized music press anymore. Um, it's so much harder for an audience to gain traction on a thoughtful level outside of just like social media buzz. And on top of that, the economy here is so completely uh, screwed, and especially with the increasing cost of higher education here, the increasing cost of living, AI coming in and already starting to obliterate entry level jobs in a lot of industries. The decimation of the music industry, the decimation of the film industry. It is so much harder for young people, especially, kind of countercultural young people or artistic young people, to survive in a city, let alone create,
Mm.
let alone go out regularly. I was talking to, recently, I was giving a talk, and this young woman was there who's talking to me, sort of like pontificating about New York nightlife or whatever, and she pointed out that like she and all of her friends uh, aren't able to go out because none of them have any money, and they all live with their parents.
Right.
And
Yes, the
they
classic.
like, even in terms of having a DIY venue where you put on shows in your house or whatever, like they can't even do that because it's their parents' house.
Yes, yes.
And
Tricky.
so, I feel like I have to. I can't just have sort of a pie in the sky thing about how art is always going to survive without acknowledging that there's hurdles to it now that are totally unprecedented. And you know I really empathize with younger people, and I really want this for them. I want that kind of connection for them. um, and I'm not just going to dismiss them by being like, oh, kids and their phones, because that's not what it is. They're up against just massive, unprecedented challenges. So I think it behooves those of us who are older, and especially those of us who have means, to support them and support their scenes, and enable their art making.
Yes. God. Well, hopefully, yes, I often, there are some bands that I just think sound interesting, but I have to acknowledge I'm just an old person who can't quite get into
Yeah.
that 16-year-old mind where you're just kind of excited about every little new single and have the energy and time to do it, though I
Of
would like
course.
to in theory. But then that's life. But look, thank you. Oh yeah, just one thing that I remember talking anecdotally slightly, David Bowie in New York went down to a jazz club and saw, was it Donnie McGlasky playing in some
Yeah.
place? Is that a club that is quite well known in New York that he went to see Donny?
I'm actually not sure what club he went to. Do you know?
No, I don't. I was just wondering if you went, oh yes, that would have been this club, and I went, "Oh, okay."
No. The world of jazz in New York, um, especially in the last, few decades, has a lot of it has become really almost paywalled. There's it's at these clubs that are expensive and have drink minimums and food minimums, and um, the musicianship. What you're going to see there is obviously world class musicianship, but um, it's not necessarily something that you can frequent if you're not, say, David Bowie.
Right.
So it's not something I'm as knowledgeable about, at least in that arena of jazz.
Yes. I do remember, I think Suzanne Vega during lockdown was playing some quite exclusive restaurant venues, which was going to cost an absolute fortune. But that was just that period of lockdown, wasn't it? I guess everyone was trying to hustle and make a buck somewhere down the line. It must have been tricky. But anyway, look, thank you ever so much for your time. And yes, fantastic. So the book is generally free and available from all good bookshops and also online all over.
Yes, all good bookshops. I like that one. Yeah, it's available at all good bookshops. It's available online. I sell signed copies from my website, which is walkonthewildsidenyc.com. It is on Amazon, but try not to get it on Amazon. You can get it somewhere else.
Yes.
And obviously there's an ebook and an audiobook and all that great stuff.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Well, look, thank you for your time. This has been amazing. And yes, just what is your next book you're going to be working on, or is that a secret at the moment?
I can't tell you too much about it, but I can tell you that it comes out in 2029 and that it is about hippie communes and cults and different kind of countercultural communities in the United States from the mid 60s through the mid 70s.
Wow. God, that's going to be fantastic. I just love those. I love those documentaries.
Yeah.
The Nature Boys, was that one? God.
Nature Boys, that was a little earlier, but that was like a predecessor. Yeah, but I've been talking to some people in the UK actually, because one of them that I'm writing about is the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which started out in London before it came to the United States. Which, if you don't know about the Process Church, that's a fun rabbit hole to go down.
Was it Process Church of the
Final Judgment?
Final Judgment.
There's a great documentary called Sympathy for the Devil about them. They were fascinating.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I'd love. Where did we go? Oh, the Biosphere. That bunch who went to the Biosphere. We went to visit, and then Steve Bannon got involved, didn't he? And it was just like,
oh God, yeah.
There's an amazing documentary, because then they build that, and then they build a ship to just start going, and they all still live together because it was just extraordinary. Yeah. God, well, I'll look forward to that, because again, that's one of my things that I absolutely love about the sort of the UK, that 60s and 70s scene that we had with lots of hippies that were moving out of London and various cities and trying to do self-sufficiency. Yes, it was
well,
good,
I'm finally getting to make good on my childhood Grateful Dead obsession.
Well, absolutely. So, this is
so it all comes back around.
It's good. But look, good luck on that, and I'll look out for this. Right. Take care. Thanks a lot.
Right,
and I'll keep in touch.
Thank you so much.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that is me in conversation with Jess Rifkin, talking about his latest book. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on any of the social media platform sites. Just do C86 Show. In the meantime, have a great week. Stay safe.